Putin's soldiers, volunteers and those who are forced, both young and old.
If he can put to death 1 million, it will be 1 million. 10? Okay, 10. 100. 100.
The Kremlin is drawing its state more and more into the war. It is preparing to replenish the thinning ranks of the Russian army.
Russia cannot fight otherwise.
Continuing to lie about the successes of the so-called special military operation and hiding their intentions to throw to the war in Ukraine everyone who can be reached by the mobilization. The State Duma of the Russian Federation is feverishly preparing the ground for large-scale mobilization, which has chances to be nationwide.
The law was written for a large war, for general mobilization, and right now the situation smacks of this very large war. Is Putin capable of this? Yes, he is. Can he do it? Yes.
Is a new wave of mobilization in Russia a phantom or reality? What is the Kremlin preparing Russia for, and how many more Russians will be thrown into the meat grinder of Putin's war? Watch in a special report PMC Russia what Putin does to prepare Russia for mobilization and protracted war.
I have made a decision to conduct a special military operation. The special military operation is proceeding in strict accordance with the schedule, according to the plan. All the tasks set are being successfully accomplished. I consider it necessary to support the proposal of the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff to carry out partial mobilization in Russia. Our losses are 10 times less than those by the armed forces of Ukraine. Our troops are behaving heroically, and all the enemy's attempts to break through our defense lines have failed during the entire offensive.
A year and a half of war, a year and a half of suffering and pain for Ukraine, and a year and a half of lies about the so-called special operation and its successes for the Russians. This bloody and cynical war was prepared by Putin and his entourage long before the full-scale invasion. Victory in this war was to be a personal triumph of Vladimir Putin, so the Kremlin top brass is intended to wage this war as long as possible, without sparing any of those who will be sent to die due to the sole decision of the Russian ruler. Summer of 2022, over the past year, the Russian army has not demonstrated any military successes, but there have been a plenty of goodwill gestures.
Kherson is a part of Ukraine. Kherson is a part of Ukraine. Kherson is a part of Ukraine.
So far, the Russian army has bogged down on the fronts, and the number of dead in the battles for Putin's appetites exceeded 250,000 people. It seems that such irrecoverable losses should make the leadership of any country think about stopping the war. But Putin's Russia does not seem to be concerned. The people continue to be lied about the successes of the special military operation.
The number of prisoners we have is growing every day, thank God. Imagine what a shock it is for the Westerns now, because they have trained us to work with all kinds of weapons.
Being precisely dosed with a new batch of propaganda.
Ukrainian mercenaries are fighting for Biden. Our volunteers from different countries are doing that for faith, Tsar and fatherland. We must win, and for this purpose, we cannot be afraid to resort to extremely tough measures. And most importantly, we must pull ourselves together internally.
When the 146 million population is lulled to sleep, by the president's tales about the upcoming victory.
The command of the special military operation acts professionally. Our soldiers fulfill their duty to their homeland courageously, steadfastly, heroically, while the whole world sees that the praised Western, supposedly invulnerable equipment is on fire.
And that mobilization, which Russians fear so much, will not be necessary. They say that there are enough contractors as well as no shortage of volunteers.
Voluntarily, people come with their own free will. 156,000 people. And yes, the work goes on. And in the past week, 9,500 people have signed contracts. This is half the corps, 9,500 men. Under these conditions, the Ministry of Defense reports that, of course, there is absolutely no need for mobilization today.
But it seems that the State Duma has not heard of this. The deputies are busily stamping out laws which will make it possible to send several millions more Russians to the front. Before going on a summer vacation, they worked hard. They did everything they could to ensure that the mistakes of last September would not be repeated.
I consider it necessary to support the proposal of the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff to carry out partial mobilization in Russia. Our armed forces oppose not only neo-Nazi formations, but in fact the entire fighting machine of the collective West.
Now, no potential defender of the fatherland can escape military service. The borders have been closed for conscripts and evaders, as summons sent in any possible way will be deemed to have been delivered. No matter if it was a registered mail delivered directly into your hands, received in a text message, or by notification in your personal account on the Public Services portal. People will be registered even without appearing in the military enlistment office. However, not appearing there will be much more expensive. Huge fines of up to 30,000 rubles have been introduced for evaders. Failure to notify the military enlistment office of a move, change of place of work or study will result in a 5,000 rubles fine. Failure to inform them about leaving Russia for more than 6 months will cost 15,000 rubles. 500,000 rubles fine will be imposed for failure to assist military commissions in case of mobilization announcement. Almost as much will be a fine for failure to provide lists for military registration.
Will you vote for preserving the comfortable life of evaders, or a repeated opportunity for them to become heroes of the capture of Upper Lars from the other side? Amendments to the law on mobilization preparation and mobilization will be sensitive. They're sensitive because the law was written for a large war, for general mobilization. And right now the situation smacks of this very large war.
Which means they will send to war everyone they possibly can, fathers of many children and even fathers of children with disabilities.
We are still looking for someone to take away, someone to protect. There will be no one to protect, understand that.
Both young and old will now be fighting. The State Duma has raised the age limits for reservists of all ranks. Those who will be able to sleep well and not be afraid of being sent to the front now are 5 years older than they used to be before, since reservists will be the first to be taken to the front lines in the new wave of mobilization. The number of conscripts will increase by 2 million people at once. According to the new law from 2024, men from 18 to 30 years old are subject for conscription into the army. Next year alone, instead of previously planned 7 million, Russia will draft 9 million men. Part of them will most likely end up on the battlefields in Ukraine.
No volunteers at all. Even when there was the first wave of mobilization, there was an official report from the Ministry of Defense that 8,000 people came first and then 12,000 more. That is to say, millions of people lined up at the borders, and then 12,000 came to the military enlistment offices. Now this figure is much lower. There are very few volunteers. That's why they are tightening the screws, that's why they are increasing fines for failure to show up at the military enlistment offices. They are creating various tricks so that people are forced to go to war. So everything is obvious here. But for the domestic market, for the domestic consumer, they say something completely different.
By October, Russia will create a unified electronic database of conscripts. It will include everyone who has reached the age of 18 and can be drafted. Rectors of universities are obligated to submit information about every student and every graduate, including girls. Now, even the lawyers will not be able to protect from mobilization and conscription. The State Duma banned them from representing the interests of citizens in military commissions. They also deprived relatives of this right if a person who received the summon has already turned 18.
Lawyers are prohibited from assisting those who are illegally mobilized. Huge fines have been imposed on businesses for evading giving information about their employees. Businesses are now required to issue summonses or accompany those summonses. Businesses must issue lists of their employees that they have, respectively the people who work for them and can be potentially mobilized.
And all these dots connect to one thing. The Kremlin authorities are preparing the ground for future mobilization, meaning that they are doing everything to make it impossible for the average Russian to avoid being sent to the front. The adopted laws make it possible to send hundreds of thousands of Russians to war, and all because any citizen of Russia is just an expendable item in Putin's war and a way to achieve his personal goals, with the primary goal now being urgent replenishment of the thinning army.
Russian troop losses in Ukraine peaked not at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but just after the beginning of the partial mobilization in 2022. Certainly, the death toll will rise as more and more civilians are recruited into the Russian army, who will not be given sufficient skills, who will not have sufficient equipment, uniforms.
The troops for Putin's war against Ukraine are being assembled using all available means. Propaganda billboards on the streets, posters in universities, commercial appealings to the conscience and patriotic feelings of the citizens, inviting them to join the contract army. Now you can serve there from the age of 18 immediately after being drafted into the army, even without minimal military training. They lure people to become volunteers with money. You have debts, loans and mortgages and can't pay them off? Then sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, enticingly offered in commercials.
This is Sasha. He's thinking about how to feed his family, but there is way out. Sasha has a friend Petya. Petya took over life and signed up as a volunteer. It is not individual propaganda theses that work, such as "you're not a real man." No, each of them individually, of course, is worthless. What works, is the totality of this propaganda. That is, wherever a person goes, wherever he goes, everywhere he encounters advertisements for contract service. Turn on the radio, go to the mall, in the mall. Inside every of them there is a loudspeaker announcing it every 3 minutes, advertising the contract service. You turned on the TV, there is something like that again. From everywhere, from every corner, there is this advertisement of the contract service. There is a lot of obsessive, unrestrained propaganda going around. If you are a man, go defend your homeland. There is no one from whom to defend it, as far as no one has ever attacked it. But it is another question. And everywhere there are such posters if you're a man. And the wife says that you bring me only 25,000 rubles, and how will I feed the children? Go and serve in the army, and you will be given 1,000,000. 700,000 rubles signing-on fee, and 300,000 rubles in salary. That is, he immediately gets 1,000,000, which is 40 times his salary.
According to Russian independent journalists, Putin's billionaires have also joined the recruitment of volunteers for the war. They employ future mercenaries in their own structures, and those immediately sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense, receiving both a salary and the payment from the ministry.
These appeals in general, they work because in the Russian Federation there are quite a few towns, settlements, and especially small towns and villages, and hamlets in which the population is simply impoverished, in which there is no work, in which there is huge unemployment, in which there is no prospect, and then when one is offered a signing-on fee to go to war in the amount of 300,000 rubles, that represents for the most of those people who are recruited There are almost 2 or 3 years of income, which is not available in these places.
которого нету, кстати, на этих местах.
Some part of the elites around him remains, but it is a smaller part. Most of them are either fleeing or sitting quietly, hatching some plans or something. But the smaller part of the elites are direct financiers of the regime, such as Deripaska, Michelson, like Rothenberg and the Timchenko. These are people who have practically no way back. Well, maybe only in exchange for Putin brought to The Hague.
The Russian Orthodox Church is also working hard for Putin's goals. They explain to Russians that death at the front is a way of washing away all their sins.
If someone, driven by a sense of duty, by the need to fulfill his oath, remains faithful to his calling and goes to do what his duty commands him to do, and if in the fulfillment of this duty the person dies, then he is undoubtedly committing an act tantamount to sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for others, and therefore it is certain that man washes away all his sins.
The Kremlin is sure that everyone will be useful in the war. Those who can be summoned but with money or ideologically hooked are lured into the war with other perks. Putin has simplified citizenship for migrants and foreigners who have signed a contract with the Ministry of Defense. Participants in the war against Ukraine are promised seats in the party and jobs in large corporations. Their children and they themselves are being enrolled in prestigious Russian universities. They are forgiven crimes of medium gravity. Women recruited in Russian colonies are released from prison sentences in exchange for being sent to Ukraine. This means that the Kremlin does not intend to withdraw troops from Ukraine, and every Russian fit for service will fall into the trap of Putin's war.
Годный к службе попадет в капкан путинской войны.
They're still avoiding forced mobilization, where they grab you by the arms and drag you to the military enlistment office. They're trying now to flood this mobilization with money. But this is for now, while Putin has money. But they're also preparing for the worst, for the times when they will either run out of money or run out of volunteers, and then they will start grabbing everyone.
And this is despite the fact that hidden mobilization did not stop. Moscow, St. Petersburg and other large cities were practically unaffected, in comparison with more than 40 regions further from the front, which felt the mobilization to full extent.
I couldn't even imagine that a conscript would be sent there to fight. He's only held a rifle twice when he had his picture taken. What is he supposed to do in the war? The mobilization was quite tough. Men were picked up in the middle of the night, in shopping malls, at workplaces, on the streets. They were given 3 hours to prepare, or simply brought to a military enlistment office, and there, on the spot, they supposedly conducted a small medical examination. Although there were no doctors, and simply took them to collection points. And at night, airplanes flew out, whole airplanes took men out in this way. And they said that mobilization was for those who had served, who were in the reserve. But in fact, it was all lie. They took fathers of many children, disabled people, and those who didn't fit the age limit.
In addition, a decree on partial mobilization announced by the Russian ruler in September 2022 has not been revoked up to now. Therefore, it is still active, and this means that the right moment the authorities can remind the citizens about it or announce a new wave of mobilization, and this time it can be nationwide. The State Duma is already preparing another law on criminal liabilities. For evaders from mobilization, they want people to be put in jail for 5 years.
Is Putin capable of this? Yes, he is. Can he do it? Yes. We are dealing with a terrorist country, where laws mean nothing. They will mobilize people, take criminals in the army, create gang formations like PMC or something like PMC that have tanks and everything else. I think they will mobilize everyone. They won in one way or another, in different ways.
The only thing is that neither the authorities nor Duma deputies nor propagandists and billionaires care about what the mobilized soldiers will fight with. While the armed forces of Ukraine regularly receive the best military equipment from their partners, isolated, sub-sanctioned Russia is slipping back into the last century in terms of technological support.
Катится в в прошлый век. К примеру,
For example, to equip 600 battalion tactical groups with about 500,000 people, which, according to some sources, Russia wants to mobilize, 6,500 tanks are needed. This is twice as many tanks as the Russian army had before the start of full-scale war. Therefore, the tactics of so-called meat assaults will become the main for Russian generals.
генералов.
Russia is progressively moving from the concept of regiments and battalions in their traditional sense to such a concept as marching battalion. When it is not possible to fully staff a unit, infantry is used predominantly.
Дальше мобилизационная готовность.
The mobilization readiness of the Russian Federation will be further hindered by its poverty. Poverty of the defense ministry, the poverty of the Russian Federation's economy, its inability to produce enough Kalashnikov rifles, enough ammunition, enough uniforms.
Значит, воинской формы.
That's what they're counting on, even if the army is poorly armed, even if it is undertrained. Putin's goal is to prolong the war not only for 10 years, but at least for a year or two, so that the West runs out of patience. So far, to ensure another year of war, Putin only needs 600-700,000 people, and unfortunately, he has such a mobilization reserve.
And it's all for one purpose: to preserve the Putin's regime, even at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives.
They are trying to wage this war, what we call, that is exhaust, knowing perfectly well that you will exhaust faster. You have fewer people. You cannot waste human lives, throw one after another into the hellfire, because, after all, you have a society, not serfdom, and your people will not agree with it. As long as the war in Ukraine continues, the Putin regime is capable, it is effective, it can impose dictatorship, aggravate the situation of Russians in the country, increase control over them, increasing dictatorship, restricting their rights and freedoms, although there is no further possibility of restricting their rights and freedoms. It remains to open concentration camps and introduce the death penalty and mass shooting for all dissidents. Defeat for him is like death in the truest sense of the word, and he thus demonstrates that he is ready to wage war to the last Russian. If he can kill 1 million, it will be 1 million. If 10, it will be 10. There are no limits. He solves one main problem: to survive himself and to keep the power, which is the guarantee of his survival. Fear of death is the main dominant motive of his personal behavior, and he doesn't care if 1 billion must be killed. In order to retain power, he will kill 1 billion. Don't even doubt it. Don't even doubt it.
The Kremlin regime will hide its true intentions to the last: to mobilize and send hundreds of thousands more people to the front. All branches of government are playing along with Putin, meanwhile preparing the state for a protracted war. And Putin is turning all of Russia into a war machine, or rather, into his own private military company, which he can throw anywhere, wherever he wants, as much as he wants, intending to send to the war everyone who can fight, and everyone who can be used as cannon fodder. And as long as the society is passive and compliant, the Russian ruler will literally walk over the corpses.
Идти по трупам.
Larisa Zubenko, Special Report.